Good afternoon. I'm Bill Traynor, Dean of Georgetown Law. Thank you very much for joining us for this roundtable discussion called Police Abolition. What does it mean? Until quite recently, most people had never heard of police abolition, but since the brutal killing of George Floyd 30 days ago, countless individuals and communities across our nation are taking a new, harder look at policing, and police abolition has become part of that conversation. Today's discussion is part of our larger series on policing. We started with an event for the Georgetown Law community called Justice for George Floyd, Understanding and Responding to Minneapolis. And from there, we took a deeper dive into some of the key issues raised. This series, called Rethinking Policing, Activism and Reform, has examined efforts to reform the police, as well as preparing the next generation for activism and healing. I invite you to explore each of these substantive and inspiring sessions on our website. But today, our panel of legal experts will focus on police abolition, what it means, what it doesn't mean, and what public safety could look like without policing as we know it today. Our aim with this series is to educate and empower those in pursuit of meaningful change, both in the wake of George Floyd's death and in the midst of a larger legacy of racial injustice in this country. So, I want to thank you all again for joining, and I want to thank Dean Chris Henning for her leadership in organizing this series. Now, let me introduce the moderator of today's roundtable, Professor Christy Lopez. Professor Lopez joined our faculty in January of 2017, right after completing a federal investigation into the Chicago Police Department. While serving with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, she led that investigation and many others that examined patterns and practices of unconstitutional policing across the country, including in New Orleans, Los Angeles, and Ferguson. Since joining our faculty, Professor Lopez has co-founded our innovative policing program, which is now launching a national peer intervention program for police departments called ABLE, or Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement. Recently, Professor Lopez has written op-eds on how a police culture of peer intervention could have saved George Floyd's life, and her thoughts on what defunding the police really means. Professor Lopez, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Dean Traynor, and we all really appreciate the support you and Georgetown have shown on these issues, and also very much appreciate the work of Dean Henning in making all of this happen. I also want to say thank you to all the viewers who joined today. We've all been talking a lot about the need to educate ourselves more on these issues, and you're all taking out the time today to do that. So I really appreciate that. I think I know I speak for the panelists when I say that as well. As Dean said, my name is Christy Lopez. I'm a professor from practice here at Georgetown, and I co-direct the Innovative Policing Project. And I'd like to invite the rest of our panelists to turn their cameras on now as I introduce the purpose of this panel and really give us a roadmap for what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so since George Floyd's death at the hands of the Minneapolis police on May 25th and the protests that followed, it seems that there might be somewhat of a sea change underway in how America views policing, right? We've seen evidence in this in the protests in cities across the United States. And just yesterday, the Associated Press released a poll that found that 95% of Americans believe that police reform in some capacity is necessary. That is unprecedented, and it is a striking change from polls conducted just 5 years ago. So one of the things that many people find encouraging about this changing national conversation about policing is the growing recognition that to achieve the kind of public safety we want, we have to look beyond policing. We have to question our assumptions about what we even mean by public safety and how we achieve it. And that's why this series is called Rethinking Policing. We have to confront the fact that criminalizing addiction and poverty and making 10 million arrests per year and mass incarceration have not provided the public safety we want, even as this approach has caused tremendous harm in Black and Latinx communities. And there's no question that it was longtime activists that forced the country to have this important conversation when they seized the moment to elevate the longstanding call for defunding the police and police abolition. But as many of you know, there's been some confusion and some concern about these terms. And many people are saying these are slogans that are counterproductive and will alienate potential police reform allies. And what we're going to discuss today is how police abolition is not a mere slogan. It has its roots primarily in Black. It's a deep and rich ideological framework that has its roots in mostly Black, mostly feminist thinking that is brilliant, positive, and redemptive. And yes, this framework has a plan for what to do about sexual violence and murder and mental health crises in a world without police as currently constituted. So if you leave here with nothing else today, I hope you gain a greater appreciation for the thoughtfulness and the depth of this framework and for the mostly Black, mostly female thinkers who developed it. We're going to start today with a look at how the idea of police abolition fits into this contemporary abolitionist framework that has been around far longer than this past May 25th. And then we're going to ask our panelists to directly address questions that many of you have asked us in the questions you submitted prior to this panel starting. You asked questions about what police abolition would look like in real life, what sorts of changes to policing and what changes more broadly would one advocate for pursuant to an abolitionist framework as compared to a reformist approach. So I want to introduce our three panelists now and then turn straight to our questions. First, we have Tahir Duckett. He is a 2017 graduate of Georgetown Law and is now a civil rights attorney at Relman Colfax, where his practice focuses on housing, education, and policing. Tahir was a founding executive committee member of Law for Black Lives DC and is the founder of Rethink, a community-based organization dedicated to preventing sexual violence. And for the past several months, he has been writing a book on police abolition. And I can vouch for the fact that he's been working on this book long before it became a topic of national conversation because we talked about it last summer. So he's been thinking about these issues for quite some time. Justin Hansford, also a graduate of Georgetown Law, is a professor of law at Howard Law School and the executive director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center there. He has long been a creative, brilliant, and energetic policing activist. He has provided community-based legal advocacy to protesters from Ferguson to DC, and he created the group Ferguson to Geneva, which wrote a shadow human rights report and traveled with members of Michael Brown's family and young activists to deliver this message to the UN Commission Against Torture in Geneva in 2014. Allegra McLeod is a professor here at Georgetown Law, and she is one of the nation's preeminent scholars teaching and writing about contemporary abolitionist movements, the criminal legal system, and legal and political theory. Before coming to Georgetown, Allegra worked as a criminal and immigration defense lawyer, and she continues to be involved in related work on a pro bono basis. So we've received many questions. We've incorporated them into the questions I will be asking the panelists, and you should feel free to submit additional questions during this conversation. So Tahir and Justin and Allegra, I want to start with the title of this program. What does police abolition mean? It's described differently by different people. If you listen and read closely, there are some elements that seem present in just about every iteration. So can you tell us what police abolition means to you and whether your meaning differs or is the same from the meaning that others ascribe to the term? We'll start with you, Tahir.
Great. So for me, police abolition is not just a destination, it's a project. It starts with a recognition that police and prisons have failed to do what they claim to do, that they don't actually keep us safe and in fact have been the source of immeasurable harm to individuals and communities, and in particular Black individuals and communities, and more importantly, that we can do better than policing. If you've looked around at the past few weeks at the indiscriminate and arbitrary use of force against protesters and individuals, the arrests, the callousness from police officers across the nation, in departments across the nation, the across-the-board rejection of the slightest whiff of accountability, and indeed the solidarity with officers who have committed horrific acts of violence, like in Buffalo, where they applauded the officers who pushed down a 75-year-old man and left him bleeding on the sidewalk, fractured his skull. That man is still in the hospital, by the way. Or in Atlanta, where there were reports of work slowdowns and the blue flu in solidarity with the officer who shot Rashard Brooks in the back as he fled. And if you've thought, I don't know how we save an institution that appears to be so far gone. I don't know if it's worth saving. If there were another way to keep ourselves safe without relying on police, then I'd be all for it. If those are things that you've thought over the past few weeks, then I think that that's the first step in being an abolitionist. And yes, there's more, right? As I said, it's a project, and I think some of the other panelists will talk a little bit more about what it means to be an active abolitionist and what it requires of us. But at its root, abolition is about having the imagination and the courage not to settle for cages and state violence as the only ways in which we can keep each other safe and hold each other accountable.
Thanks so much. I think that's a lot of people are actually asking themselves that question right now. Am I an abolitionist? What does that even mean? How can I describe myself? Justin, let's turn to you now. Tell us, you've talked a little bit about a turning point you had and how that deepened your understanding of abolition. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, my experiences with the question of police violence, as you described, go way beyond this incident with Mr. Floyd. Of course, it goes back to early in my life, but most dramatically in Ferguson, when I lived in St. Louis, I had the opportunity to be a protester as well as a practicing attorney and a law professor at the same time when I was helping with the Ferguson activists there. The most significant part of my experience in Ferguson was taking part in the representation of Mike Brown's family and having the opportunity to work closely with Mike Brown's mother, Leslie McSpadden, when she sought to take the case to the United Nations. It was a turning point in my career. And I got to work with her and help her produce her testimony. And I saw up close the type of anguish that she had to experience. She's talked about the PTSD and the trauma of seeing her son laying on the ground for over 4 hours in the hot sun in August of 2014. She continues to have those effects to this day, and of course will have those effects for the rest of her life. And at the time, there was nothing I wanted more than to see the conviction of Darren Wilson, who killed Mike Brown, and the punishment of the killer, in my honest assessment, would have been something which was fitting to create some sort of sense of justice for myself, for many of us throughout the country, but most importantly for Leslie. And in her experience, even today, she still lives in that community, has seen the killer of her son in that community. And he's, we have many situations, George Zimmerman, not just the police officers, but those in similar situations who not only seem to not face consequences, but in some way, shape, or form are supported in their, continued feeling that they were justified for the killings. So for me, it's a big turning point or a big challenge to move towards an abolitionist framework, which would demand that if we're going to abolish something like policing or even maybe abolish imprisonment, we would have to move away from this conception of justice as revenge or retribution and think of another way to create justice for the families, for the communities that have been broken apart by the violence of the state, which the state initiated. They brought the violence to us. And so this decision to not think that the fair response is to bring violence to them in return is an ethical decision, more so than a decision based solely on any other principle. And it's a hard decision to make. But if I think hard about what I would like to see for Leslie, We've been working recently to try to create an opportunity for there to be a fund for victims of police violence and their families. So, things like mental health services can be provided for families. Funding, if in case the person who was killed is a primary breadwinner for the family, like George Floyd or Eric Garner, funds to support those families is perhaps the case that justice looks like reparations more so than justice looks like retributive justice, or even if we're going to take the perspective that is not justice, that retributive justice is not justice in of itself, we would use the term revenge to conceptualize what it is I wanted when it came to Darren Wilson or George Zimmerman or others. So I think for many people, that's an important principle to understand. When folks are arguing for abolition, it's a very generous argument. It's a very benevolent argument. It's not an argument that is a crazy, wild argument from the left, from radicals. It's an argument from people who have done some interior work, some spiritual work, which allows them to move past the desire for revenge. And this is not just a situation when it comes to individual police killings. When you talk about race as a principle, people around the country and around the world should be very happy that Black people are not interested in revenge as much as they're interested in abolition, which is it's a generous principle saying that we think justice goes beyond revenge. And so for me, I admire all the people who call for abolition as opposed to retribution. And I think that they are leaders that we should be trying to emulate and continue to admire.
Thank you so much, Justin, and I'm so glad that you emphasize that. I think it's one of the things people don't recognize about the abolitionist framework is how, that is the word that comes to my mind often in talking about this aspect of it, how generous it is, the moral clarity of it, the interior work, as you put it, that people have done. And I just want to underscore that this is work done by people who have seen their communities, the victims of a punitive retributive justice for literally their entire history in this country. From just to take one small example, the crack versus cocaine differential sentencing that impacted African-American communities, the really, overwhelmingly harsh sentences that have been premised on the color of people's skin. And these same communities are saying, no, we need to turn away from that. Not, we want the same back at you, but we all need to turn away from that. And I think that there's something we can all learn from that, and we should all recognize how truly profound that is. So thank you so much for telling us about your own journey to get to that point. I want to turn now to you, Allegra, to talk a little bit about what abolition means to you, and a little bit. We'll get into just a bit about how it fits into the larger structure. But how does the police abolition part of this fit into that framework for you?
Thank you so much, Christy Lopez. Thank you to Bill Traynor, to Chris Henning, and Tahir, Duckett, and Justin Hansford. And many thanks to all of you in the audience for taking time to listen and for being open to these ideas. So I wanted to begin in thinking about this question by recognizing that we're at this moment of great possibility in the face of an historic uprising against racial injustice around the world. And at the same time, there are already forces gathering to redirect and distort the movement's demand for abolition to make this moment less transformative than it could be. Trump has signed an executive order on policing. There's legislation pending in Congress related to police reform, and there are proposals to modestly reduce police budgets in jurisdictions around the country. But these proposals, in my view, largely fail to grasp the radical demand for abolition of the current movement that Justin and Tahir have just begun to elucidate, and they're, for the most part, destined to fail in bringing about meaningful change. The call for abolition today, I believe, is a call for radical change. It's connected to earlier radical abolitionist movements against slavery and its persistent legacies in the criminal legal system against imperialism and its afterlives in militarized violence at home and around the world. More than 500 years of expropriation and exploitation of Black people, indigenous communities, and other marginalized peoples. But abolition isn't only about tearing things down. It's a positive movement, a radical movement for a more just, egalitarian, social, political, and economic order. So what do I mean by radical in contrast to reformist? As the abolitionist scholar, activist, and icon Angela Davis reminds us, radical means, in an etymological sense, forming the root. To get at the root of injustice will require us to make radical changes, not window dressing reforms. It will require radical change to policing in the entire criminal legal system, but also numerous other domains of domestic and foreign policy that uphold deep-seated structural racism and violence. It's also possible that this moment will fail to bring about much change if it's captured by forces invested in limited reform and committed to preserving much of the status quo. Abolitionists call for more than retraining police and the kinds of reforms contemplated by the Trump administration and by Congress, as longstanding abolitionist organizations like Critical Resistance and newer formations like 8 to Abolition have recently underscored. Trump and the legislation proposed by both parties seek, for example, to ban chokeholds. But it's worth remembering that Eric Garner was killed by a chokehold in a jurisdiction that had prohibited chokeholds. Moreover, even if the police comply with such a ban, it doesn't prohibit other legal ways of killing people, nor does it prohibit other near-death experiences perpetrated by police. These sorts of reforms have failed to bring about meaningful change over decades. Of course, some of what Congress has proposed, for example, demilitarizing the police, ending qualified immunity, would be steps in the right direction. But abolition is a call for something else not reflected in these measures. It's a call for a move away from reliance on policing, prosecutions, and prisons, and for justice in the domestic and global political economy. So my view is that calls for abolition, calls to defund the police, do mean what they seem to suggest. They are calls for radical change because we need radical change that goes to the roots of structural racism. I think it's also important to emphasize that abolition is as much a positive project as a negative project, along the lines that Justin just developed. Abolition is about eliminating racialized violence in the criminal legal system, but it's also crucially about building a more just and equitable world and developing new, more honest and grounded ways of understanding our current world. And I'll say more about this throughout our conversation, but I wanted to offer one illustration now from Chicago, where abolitionist organizing has flourished in the last several years. As a way of addressing the extreme brutality against Black people overseen by Chicago Police Commander John Burge for decades in Chicago, abolitionists there pushed successfully for the Chicago City Council to pass a reparations ordinance in 2015. And this reparations ordinance provided financial compensation to survivors of police torture. It provided mental health and medical care, educational scholarships, a public memorialization effort, and it changed the public school curriculum so children would learn this history. Abolitionist organizer and thinker Miriam Kaba explained the ordinance as abolitionist in that it aimed to offer the beginnings of a positive vision of justice beyond criminal prosecution and punishment. A few years later, in 2017, abolitionist youth activists in Chicago began to push a defund the police campaign and more broadly to push for participatory budgeting. Participatory budgeting is another positive abolitionist project which allows the people of a city, whether Chicago or DC or Puerto Alegre, Brazil, or which was one of the origin points of participatory budgeting, on a more participatory democratic basis to shape public spending decisions and to direct public spending toward excellent, equally distributed public education, public health, affordable housing, towards community-based organizations addressing violence, towards alternative first responders, towards what some call solidarity economy institutions like worker-owned cooperatives, community land trusts, and away from militarized and racialized policing and caging. In other words, hand in hand with the demand for abolition or to defund the police has long been a call to fund Black communities to create a new, more just and equitable economic and political order. So there's so much more to say about all this, but I'll stop there.
Yes, there is. And I thank you for pointing out a couple of things. We are going to get in more to what you're talking about, some of the examples from Chicago, and some of the interplay between the defund movement and the abolition movement. But I very much appreciate you emphasizing that abolition is only partly about defund and shifting those resources. It very much is about building up Black communities and Latinx communities. And that is one of the real creating parts of it. And I think that's really very important. So, and we are going to turn to that. We're going to turn to, we're going to turn to some of the interplay between reforms, as you pointed out, and why some of the Trump reforms, all of the Trump reforms don't go far enough. The bill in Congress doesn't go far enough, and what that means for this. But first, I want to, before we go there to the nuts and bolts, I want to just dig a little bit more deeply into this intellectual history for this democratic framework of not just police abolition, but abolition. And I want to do that just because it is so important. It is something that's been missed in so many of the conversations that we've had. Not surprisingly, since many of the people didn't, most people had never heard of this before May 25th, and so they're just starting to even try to figure out what this means. So can you each of you tell us a little bit about how police abolition fits into the broader abolitionist tradition and what that means? Let's start, why don't we start with you, Justin, to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that it's significant to note that the history of abolition in the United States is a history of constitutionalism. In fact, there is a article that was recently published in the Harvard Law Review by Dorothy Roberts entitled Abolition Constitutionalism, which focuses on the issue of prison abolition, but frames it as part of the long history of primarily Black activists, also Black women activists. Of course, Harriet Tubman is the first abolitionist that many people think of. But there's a long history of people who have seen abolition as, again, not a completely unprecedented phenomena, but one that is rooted in our nation's history in terms of the resistors, and even more so than those who have resisted slavery, who called for the abolition of slavery, or Jim Crow, those who called for the abolition of Jim Crow. Even more than their calls, I think it's significant to note that their calls were rooted in an interpretation of the Constitution that argued that, based on the preamble and the assertion that this is a country that was built on the idea of freedom, these systems that are anti-freedom in the truest sense, whether it's, of course, slavery, of course, Jim Crow. And I think if you think about mass incarceration from the prison perspective, and racialized policing and police violence as the gatekeeper, or the initial introduction that many people have to the mass incarceration system through racial profiling, through the use of what we saw in Ferguson, expressed in the Ferguson report, which you helped to create, Christy. The idea that certain communities are targeted for enhanced enforcement of the law, allowing them to be transitioned into a state of criminalization for activities that on the other side of town are everyday activities. I think that is a tradition of resistance to that is based in not just a history of activism, but also a history of constitutional interpretation. I think that when we do this type of work, it's imperative that we look at it as coming from a tradition. It's not something that, again, the activists invented in 2020. There's a history of scholarship on abolition, which, of course, Allegra is our expert on. There's a history of legal work when it comes to abolition. People have been creating frameworks through an abolitionist lens for reimagining our economy when we were talking about abolition from enslavement, reimagining public space, reimagining education, and of course, today, reimagining public safety. These are all different systems that an abolitionist lens historically has been able to help to reinvent. And so this, if we look at it through the lens of that history, this is simply the most recent incarnation of using that lens to reinvent a particular system that intersects with all of our lives.
Yeah, thank you so much for pointing out that breadth and also for pointing out the link with constitutional law and constitutional thinking. I suspect that many of the people viewing this today are lawyers or future lawyers. And it's certainly one of the reasons I felt it was important to go to a law school, because that thinking, it's not just activists that have work to do. It's not just community organizers who have work to do. It is lawyers and prosecutors and judges who have work to do on this front. And Allegra wrote a wonderful article called, I believe, Police Violence and Constitutional Complicity. I hope I'm not butchering the name, but that's certainly the idea behind it, in which he talks about how some of the Supreme Court cases really do reinforce a very problematic approach. And it's part of this entire idea that to fix policing, we have to look outside policing. And one of the places we in the legal field must look is inward at what we as judges and as prosecutors and as lawyers do in this space. Let me move now to Tahir and see what you have to add, if anything, to that. I know we all want to get to the nuts and bolts part, but please, I know that you've got something here as well.
Yeah, I think it's so important as we think about abolition to think, yes, about the the scholars and the activists who have led the way, right? Allegra mentioned Angela Davis. I think about Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and I think, kind of currently about Miriam Kaba. But I think it's also important for us to think about and appreciate and invest in the organizations doing abolitionist work in our communities, and that have been doing abolitionist work in our communities for a long time. It is really important that we recognize that these calls for abolition are coming first and foremost from communities that are most affected by policing and most affected by crime, right? And so, when we think about the concerns about, oh, well, what are we going to do about crime and what are we going to do about, unsafe neighborhoods? It is the people who are in these neighborhoods and who are investing in trying to fix those neighborhoods. I think in DC about Black woman-led organizations like One DC or Collective Action for Safe Spaces, who are investing serious physical effort, serious emotional labor in building safer communities. And 2A1, so many of these organizations are saying, look, police are not actually helping us go through this process. Police are not actually helping us build these neighborhoods. And so, yes, it is important for us to be doing the reading and to be listening to the scholars who have been thinking about this for a long time. But we have incredible abolitionist leaders in our communities. And when I say abolitionist leaders, I don't mean, I mean much more in the way that Allegra was referring to as being the sort of positive vision of abolition, who are working to actively sort of build neighborhoods and communities where police are no longer necessary, where prison is not the thing that we rely on in order to keep us safe. When we think about investing in Black communities left behind by the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration, and hundreds of years of extraction of resources without reinvestment, these are the kinds of organizations that really are at the forefront and have to be the first place that we look to when we think about the reinvestment of the funds that we're calling for divesting from current departments. And a lot of these local organizations are not the national ones that often get so much sparkle and shine in moments like these. And I don't have to name those organizations for you to know who I'm talking about. You know, the ones that show up at the top of Google when we search for civil rights organizations. We're talking about, you know, small organizations that are often volunteer led, and, you know, that many of whom have been shut out of the who have been shut out of the nonprofit industrial complex, who don't have the connections to wealth and to funders that will help them bring their organizations and the incredible work that they're doing on less than shoestrings, to be completely honest, to scale.
Thank you. Allegra, anything to add there before we move to some of the more, what this looks like in real life?
Building on Justin and Tahir's comments, it might be worth identifying two specific genealogies of contemporary abolitionist movements. So first, Black feminists and other women of color organizers like Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Miriam Kaba, who've already been mentioned, as well as Rachel Hertzing, Mimi Kim, and others, some of whose work will be posted to the chat, began to develop an abolitionist praxis in the 1990s, both through intellectual work and also through organizing, as Justin and Tahir have emphasized. And they did this in response to domestic violence, sexual violence, and state violence, and the failures of the criminal legal system to respond to this violence. So these organizers were concerned with how to keep women of color, LGBTQ people, Black people, and other people of color safe when police and prisons either promised more harm in response to interpersonal violence or in many instances failed to respond at all. So through organizations like Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, and later Survived and Punished, these Black feminist organizers and others continued the efforts of the Black Panthers and other Black radicals to re-envision collective well-being without prisons and police. The Black Panthers, something that's neglected in the history of that organization, had pioneered community-based public health clinics, free breakfast programs for children as means to promote public safety, cop watch initiatives, to reduce police violence against Black men and women, and Insight began to develop transformative justice and related community-based interventions to address gendered harm that police either ignored or exacerbated. And there's now an extensive international constellation of practices and of resources that are devoted to preventing and responding to sexual violence, to domestic violence, and anti-LGBTQ violence in abolitionist terms. And a resource list of some of this work will be linked in the chat and circulated by email later. And this work teaches us that abolition is in important respects a feminist project, and its intellectual history is strongly influenced by Black radical and women of color feminisms. One other important part of the intellectual history of contemporary abolitionist movements that Justin and Tahir noted can be traced to the scholarly work of Angela Davis and Professor Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who were co-founders of Critical Resistance and who were also active in the formation of the organization I just mentioned, Insight. And in her book, Are Prisons Obsolete, almost 20 years ago now, Angela Davis located contemporary prison and police abolition movements as continuing these long interconnected struggles against slavery and imperialism, white settlerism, the genocide of indigenous peoples, as well as resistance to other forms of structural oppression. And Davis emphasizes the aspect of positive abolition in connection to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. And in his masterwork, Black Reconstruction in America, Davis draws out how Du Bois identifies the failure of Reconstruction and of the Civil War to end slavery. In fact, many formerly enslaved people were forced to labor on the same plantations where they labored as slaves, in part because of a criminal legal system that penalized the conduct of free Black people and consigned them to debt peonage, to convict leasing, and to chain gangs. And these ideas have been popularized by Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, by Ava DuVernay's film 13th, Du Bois, though, regards these developments specifically as a failure of the positive project of abolition, the failure of Reconstruction, which Davis and Ruthie Gilmore argue remains the work of abolitionists today. And for both Davis and Gilmore, whose work has inspired the youth leading today's movement, the question is how to create a social order that's genuinely inclusive, that distributes wealth and opportunity fairly, that reckons with the racial injustice of the present and past, and that operates without the violence of policing that we witnessed in the horrific murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and so many others. And the Black feminist abolitionist tradition insists that the answer to this question has to be in part an economic answer, one that addresses the economic misery and exploitation visited on Black people and other marginalized people in this country and around the world historically and presently. Abolition is about constituting a new economic order, and this project is domestic, but it's also necessarily international in its dimensions, as Ruthie Gilmore reminds us in a podcast on The Intercept that should be linked in the chat as well. Abolition is focused on racial capitalism, militarism at home and around the world. So whether it's a Green New Deal, a Red Deal, participatory budgeting, reparations, modern monetary theory, these are all different contested ideas, but abolitionists recognize the violence of policing as connected to the social abandonment of Black communities, Indigenous communities, and other marginalized people. And abolition seeks to abolish these unjust economic and social orders and to create a new, more equitable political and economic order in its stead.
Thanks so much, Allegra. And I think with what all of you have given us, you've given us a lot of information about the what abolition is and the why the abolition is, but I like how you raised in this last piece that all of this is to inform the how do we get there? And you know, that's where I want to turn now. We're going to provide a list tomorrow. Everybody who registered will get an email with a list. Some of you have asked in the Q&A for more readings on this. We will provide a list of some readings if you're interested in the theory behind a lot of this, as well as some of the toolkits about how you do it. But let's move now to the how you might actually do this. And I want to just point out quickly, there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country. There are 50 states. We do not have a national policing system in this country. We have the only national standard we have is the Constitution, and for any number of reasons, that is not a sufficient regulatory force for local policing. And so abolitionist thinking would necessarily look different in every place, just as police reform looks different in every place. So there's no one answer to what this would look like. So that's why I think it's so important that we talk about these principles. So as we move on to this how, you can keep those in mind as you're trying to figure out how to navigate these myriad systems that you'll be navigating as you attempt to look at how to change policing. But speaking now as someone who's been doing police reform for decades, to me, in many respects, defunding the police seems like the natural evolution of reform, at least to some extent, defunding, right? Just based on what we've learned about what works and doesn't work. You know, we have to stop putting all of our public safety eggs into the criminal justice basket. That's just something that became quite clear to me in Ferguson and was really brought home in Chicago for a lot of the reasons that Allegra brought up. And a lot of people seem to agree with that, right? The Houston Chief of Police, Art Acevedo, who's also the head of the hugely influential policing organization called the Major City Chiefs Association, he recently said that aiming to respond to addiction and mental illness and even violence with something other than force is not only laudable, but, quote, an absolutely necessary long-term goal. Right? So in that respect, this defund in terms of shifting these funds from policing and investing in Black communities and investing in the social programs doesn't really seem that radical to me. But obviously in other respects, the abolitionist framework is much more far-reaching than the calls to shift funds from policing to other approaches. Justin's already told us a little bit about that in terms of a very redemptive approach to how we organize ourselves rather than a punitive or retributive approach. But can you give us a sense, and I want to get really, really specific here, about how abolitionist reforms would be different than reformist reforms, and how defund efforts fit into all of this framework. And how would we, right? The question that we always get, how would you respond to problems like domestic violence, sexual violence, homicide, in a world where policing looked very differently than today? We've already put in the chat a chart from the group Critical Resistance that compares what they call abolitionist reforms to reformist reforms, and that's something that people might want to look at later, but it is also something that we might talk about right now. So let's talk now, let's start talking with you, Justin. You've already got some of this, but specifically, how does a reform effort, an organizing effort, look differently under an abolitionist framework versus a reform framework?
Sure. Well, I'll give you my perspective on that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you can wrap your mind around abolition without seriously engaging with the question of reparation. I think the two go hand in hand, because if you are looking at exploring options and alternatives to retributive justice, the question is, how do you get justice in a situation where there has been harm? And people who are looking for justice through retribution, who may possibly be denied that through the traditional method, need an alternative method, which I believe reparation is a better method. And so when we think about what I just described earlier in terms of provisions in a local budget for mental health services, for education services, things that are targeted in the communities that have been directly harmed in many cases. And I think many of us think about the role of police in society as a creator of public safety. And I think that conceptualization of policing is a incorrect and inaccurate understanding of what police do. I think if we are more clear on what police actually do in our society, the overwhelming, I believe, is some number, over 90% of police work is responding to nonviolent incidents. There's a lot of violence that is created by police, and they intervene and stop less violence than people think, and they create more violence than people think. And the truth of the matter is, if we're thinking about public safety in a more accurate way, I mean, I'm just using an example, coming into my mind now. We live in a society where there are not enough ventilators for people in hospitals, but we have tanks for police. If you were really trying to create public safety, people will be safer with more ventilators in their hospitals and less police. And so if you understand public safety accurately, the project is less confusing. If you think about taking the financial resources away from institutions like police, who are creating a lot of harm. We have documented police killings in the United States that are astronomical compared to other countries. We have yet to document the amount of injuries and acts of violence that don't kill people, but still maim and seriously harm people. And almost any interaction is violent, in an emotional sense. So if we were to take resources away from conceptualizing public safety as police intervention and think about these other interventions in our public health system, in our communities, in terms of the programs like Insight and things that have been created by these Black feminists who have had these traditions being built up for years. If we invested in those programs, we would be creating a more safe society. So I think I'm trying to be as concrete as possible in a short period of time, but I think that you have to follow the money. From my perspective, you have to follow the money and you have to reallocate the money. And I think that it's perfect for us to move from, in 2014, we had a slogan, whether if you want to think about Black Lives Matter as a slogan, it was a slogan that was a symbolic slogan. And we shifted to a slogan today, which is a substantive slogan that includes the proposal to be given directly to local, state, and national legislators in the actual slogan itself. So I know people are having a hard time coming to grips with it, but I think the demand is so clear. It's a financial demand that is so clear that it's hard to just keep talking over and over again what does that mean? What does that mean? I think people are pretty clear what it means to defund the police. But I think the problem is getting wrapping your mind around and coming to grips with the actual need for following through on the demand.
Yeah. And I think what your answer really underscores, if there's a lot of work here and the devil's going to be in the details. And it starts with this idea of you have to rethink what you're talking about public safety. So you're like, you know what? Public safety is not just a criminal justice system thing. It is about the medical system and the public health system and the education system. And then really do the work of looking at the budgets. What are my police doing? Do we need so many people doing this? Could we have more public safety if we were to shift over? So it's those sorts of things. And the abolitionist approach, I think, is one of the things that you've pointed out and that all of you have. It's not just about the defund, right? It is absolutely essential in that, as you've just put it, is to build up those other institutions. That has to be a part of any abolitionist strategy in real life and what it would look like. And, unfortunately, there's no one answer because every community is going to look differently in terms of what they're currently doing with public safety and how they currently define it and the role that the police play. But almost certainly, you're going to have to think about shifting some of those resources. Tahir, tell us about what this looks like in real life, and especially if you could talk about this question that people have of, well, what do we do about homicides and sexual assaults and domestic violence? You run an organization that works on reducing sexual violence. So what do you think about this? You obviously care about this issue, and you don't want to see a world where when police go away, there's chaos on the streets. How does this get addressed under this framework?
Yeah, and I want to start by diving a little bit more into something that Justin was mentioning, because I think it's really, really important for folks to have a better sense of the role that police officers actually play right now when it comes to public safety. And I've dropped a link into the chat that is a link to a piece that the New York Times did just this week on how police actually spend their time. Studies have shown that around 8 in 10 incidents handled by police officers are considered by the police themselves to be non-criminal matters in the first place. Police officers arrest on average one person every 2 weeks. The vast majority of those aren't felony arrests. 40% of police officers in a high crime area in New York City, a study showed that 40% of police officers didn't make a single felony arrest in a year. And so, when you look at a police officer's time, the New York Times link that I just dropped shows that 4% of a police officer's time is spent dealing with violent crime, right? So right off the top of the bat, when folks are worried about, when I call somebody, who's going to be there, who's going to respond, it is a fraction of what we're actually asking police to do. The vast majority of what we're asking them to do is the kind of security theater that inevitably results in the ongoing harassment that we see in Black communities. I also want to put this in context here in the District of Columbia. So we have about 4,200 police officers here in the District of Columbia for a population of about 700,000 folks. There were 1,700 violent crimes for the entire year reported in Washington, D.C. last year. And so at that rate, each police officer would handle a violent crime at the rate of like once every 2.5 years or so. And then even when they are working on crime, it's far from clear that they're the most effective way of handling the problem. Nationwide, police officers only make an arrest in 50% of homicides. In many Black communities, police only make an arrest in about a third of homicides. So when people ask me, what are we going to do about murderers? I want to ask them, well, what are we doing about them right now? We are investing $115 billion nationwide in a system that is designed to keep us, that is supposed to keep us safe. It is not designed to keep us safe, but it is supposed to keep us safe. And yet, the actual effectiveness is far from clear. I do want to talk specifically about sexual violence, because sexual violence is perhaps the single most obvious way in which police fail to do what they are supposed to, what they are supposed to do. Studies suggest that there are about 1,000 sexual assaults in DC every year. Only 92 were even reported. Right? So we are talking about a fraction that even make it into the process of the carceral system. And we have to think about why that's the case, right? And much of that is because the carceral system has had forever such a poor record of handling sexual assault that nobody wants to report in the first place. Survivors have often told me that when they do report, they are as re-traumatized by police and prosecutors in ways that are just as harmful as the assault itself. And so we're talking about only a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of people who commit acts of sexual violence are ever caught, prosecuted, and convicted. And if they are convicted, we send them to prisons, some of the most sexually violent places on earth. And so what we're asking, and what abolitionists are asking, is that instead of investing in these responses, that we think much, much more about prevention in the first place. And that requires us investing in programs, yes, like Rethink, the program that I started here in DC that does sexual violence prevention work, particularly focusing on helping adolescent boys doing consent education in schools, working with adults to help them teach kids how to draw safer boundaries, how to build consent practices themselves. And look, I'll be completely honest, I work a lot with people who are survivors of sexual violence, and most of the people that I talk to do not think that we should be relying more heavily on police or on prisons in order to prevent these, in order to prevent or respond to acts of sexual violence. And in fact, most of the organizers I know who are abolitionists, who are pushing for these deep changes, who are pushing for us not to respond to sexual violence with incarceration, are themselves survivors of sexual violence. And so centering those voices means that we need to invest the time and energy in focusing on prevention and in focusing on accountability practices that don't rely on the same sorts of programs that, they're telling us are re-traumatizing in the first place.
Yeah, thank you. And there's only a minute left, but I just want to underscore that listening to the people who have been victims of these crimes and asking them what they want to see policing look like in the future is a really great place to start. And most, many victims of sexual violence will tell you this current system isn't working. And it's interesting to note that we've in the past decades asked police to be more proactive. And a lot of this is just recognizing that yes, proactiveness is good, prevention is good, but maybe people besides the police would be better at doing that proactive preventative work, in addition to the need to have a response afterwards. We literally have 1 minute left, but I want to give each of you a chance. One of the questions we got the most was, what can I do? So I want to give each of you the chance to tell us, just in the little bit of time we have left, what are the 3 things that people can do to work on these issues going forward, not only tomorrow, but in the coming days and weeks and months. Allegra, we'll start with you. You're on mute.
Well, I think one important thing to ask of yourselves, building on what Christy just suggested, is to support Black-led movements and organizations for racial and economic justice, to donate to Black abolitionist projects like bail funds, participatory defense efforts, mutual aid projects, to help people escape being held in jail simply because they're too poor to afford posting bond. I think it's important, as Justin was suggesting, to support efforts to deal openly and honestly with the tremendous debt owed to Black and Indigenous peoples in this country. And I also think it's important to support the solidarity economy, worker co-ops, participatory budgeting efforts, community land trusts, and other projects that aim to build economic and political power in marginalized communities.
Thanks so much, Allegra. Those are all really important things to be thinking about. Justin, what have you got? 3 things people can do.
Certainly. Well, first of all, what Allegra said was accurate. I think also support candidates for political office that are genuinely committed to addressing racial inequality and supporting the movement to create a more just approach to public safety. In addition to supporting those candidates on a national level, think about supporting them on a local level. Right here in Washington, D.C., we have local campaigns to cut spending on policing in D.C. We had a candidate for Ward 4 City Council who is in full support of that initiative, who was victorious a couple of weeks ago. We see also, there's programming locally, like the Real News in Baltimore. Democracy Now! Is a national program. There are definitely places you can look for information on these issues. So start to look beyond the traditional venues of the New York Times and Washington Post for your news on these issues so that you can have a more informed perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah, Tahir.
I'm just gonna give one. The police that we get now is the product of an unwillingness to engage, right? There are neighbors making noise, I'll call the cops. There's a homeless man asleep on my doorstep, I'll call the cops. Let's let someone else do it. And I think that abolitionist work means a commitment to all do more ourselves so that we aren't outsourcing our community fabric to police officers. And that means making individual choices when you're thinking about calling the police, but it also means different individual choices when it comes to participating in how we run our cities. Inertia isn't with us, right? So we can't just sign a change.org petition and expect, Mayor Bowser to do the right thing. Right? We have to push to divest, we have to push to reinvest, and we have to keep our eye on the ball long term. And that means, participating in the process more than just voting.
Yeah, thanks so much. That you're talking about more interior work there in part, as well as more community building, both really important aspects of any path forward. I just want to thank everyone, all of our panelists for being here today and sharing their incredible insights and wisdom with us, and all of the attendees who viewed this. And again, as I said, we will be sending out a list of resources if people want to dig more deeply into some of these issues. Thank you so much. Thank you for being part of us for this panel and for this entire series.
Thank you.